So you finally heard back from that reader or critique partner or editor whose feedback you were eagerly awaiting, and it's bad. What do you do now? Receiving negative feedback on your story can be so discouraging and disheartening because you've put your heart and soul into it, and now it feels like this person is just tearing that apart. At worst, receiving bad feedback can make you feel like you should just give up and put the story down and never look at it ever again. But receiving feedback, and that includes negative or constructive feedback, is a critical component of strengthening your story, especially if you are looking toward publication. Ultimately, the best way to grow as a writer is to receive feedback on your work and then iterate your story based on that. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I want to give you some practical tips and strategies for what to do when you receive that bad feedback so that you can deal with it productively and ensure that it ultimately does help you grow in your writing process. As a book editor, it is my job to provide constructive feedback, so I'm going to bring you my insights from working with hundreds of authors ranging from first-time authors all the way to best-selling authors. If you're new here and you haven't checked out my channel yet, welcome. Every week, I either post videos with tactical writing tips like this one, or I talk about the book publishing industry, particularly from the perspective of the Big Five, as that is my professional background. So if any of that interests you, please go ahead and subscribe. I promise you won't regret it. And if you can go ahead and hit that thumbs up button before we get started, that would really help out my channel. So you've just received that bad feedback. What is the first thing you should do? First, consider the source of the feedback. Did this feedback come from someone who has a deep understanding of your genre? Are they a voracious reader in the genre? Are they someone with professional editorial experience? Are they a very developed writer in their own right? If the answer is no, and they don't fall into any of those categories, then it's possible that this person isn't really the best equipped to give you constructive feedback. So in that case, it might be best to take their notes with a grain of salt. Whenever you receive bad feedback, it is very important to understand that writing is a subjective art. The truth is that not everyone is going to like or connect with your story. Look at the reviews of any best-selling book out there and you are going to see 1-star reviews. That's why when you are in the phase of developing your manuscript, which is a very vulnerable place to be in, I recommend being extremely picky about who you solicit feedback from. It should be someone whose opinions you respect and value, and someone who ideally understands the genre to some degree and your intentions for this story. If the feedback came from someone who really isn't your target reader, nor has any editorial expertise, then it might be best to brush off their feedback. But if the feedback did come from a trusted and valid source, then I recommend moving on to the next step, which is to take a step away from the feedback and your story. Receiving negative feedback is emotionally overwhelming. It's not what you want to hear, right? You want to hear that your story is perfect, there are no changes, and everyone loved it. But that's not realistic. Receiving negative feedback, though, can feel like someone's calling your baby ugly, and that is an emotional experience that no one likes. So that's why it's critical at this point for you to take a step back and detach from the feedback and the story so that you can have that objective perspective. This is admittedly extremely challenging to do, so I recommend doing whatever you can to literally distance yourself from the feedback and from the story. For instance, if the feedback came to you via physical note, put it away in a drawer for now. If it came to you via email, archive that email for now. I promise it will still be there for you to find when you need it. And as for your manuscript, if it's on your desktop, go ahead and put it in a different folder hidden away. This will allow your mind to go elsewhere and not just be continually reminded of everything that's wrong with the book and all of this negative feedback that you need to deal with. Or spend some time doing a different hobby entirely to get your mind off of it. Then, once you've taken a few days or a week or even a month away from the story and the feedback, now is the time where you can return to it with fresh eyes. This way, you're going to be able to evaluate the feedback much more effectively and discern if and how you want to implement that feedback. Whenever I, as a developmental editor, deliver my feedback to my clients, I always recommend that they take a couple days before getting back to me for this exact reason. Your initial emotional response to the feedback is likely going to be very different from your response once you've had some time to ruminate on it and you've let it marinate a bit. That brings me to the next step for dealing with negative feedback, which is returning to the manuscript and the feedback with fresh eyes. Since that initial emotional response has worn off, now you really have a better perspective. So at this point, I want you to ask yourself, does this feedback resonate with me? Does it align with my intentions for the story and my vision for it? Do you see where that person was coming from with that feedback? Do you agree with that feedback? If so, then it is likely worth it to figure out how you might implement that feedback as you revise your manuscript. But if you feel that the feedback is actually totally misaligned with your intentions for the story and it doesn't make sense to you, then I wouldn't take any action on that feedback quite yet. It could be the case that you're not fully understanding the feedback, or it could be the case that you are just disagreeing with this reader, and that is completely fine. When I'm working with my clients as an editor, I always tell them that if a suggestion of mine does not resonate, that it is totally fine for them to not take it. Ultimately, this is your story at the end of the day, not theirs. Before we dive into the next tip, I wanted to let you know about a free resource I have for anyone who has a work in progress. It's called my Story Self-Assessment Worksheet, and it's a simple, easy quiz designed to help you see your story from a new perspective, like what we're talking about in today's video, and help you return to it with fresh eyes. Downloading it's also going to sign you up for my newsletter, where I publish exclusive interviews with publishing industry insiders and successful authors, and they are giving some really amazing pieces of advice, so I don't want you to miss out on that. You can also check out the past installments of my newsletter in the description below. So the next thing I want you to do when you receive negative feedback is to seek others' insight. If you're just on the fence about whether you should take this feedback seriously and change something in your story, or whether you should just brush it off and discard it, then I recommend getting some additional feedback from trusted sources. You might find that another reader has that exact same note, in which case it's likely that other people would have that same note, and maybe it would be worth addressing in your manuscript, because now there is clearly a pattern of readers calling out that same issue. But you might alternatively find that this other reader has the exact opposite feedback. That happens sometimes. In which case, that indicates that people are interpreting your story differently, and maybe you don't need to jump the gun and change your manuscript because of that initial person's feedback. Again, I strongly recommend being extremely selective about who you ask for feedback, because if you seek feedback from the wrong sources, it can ultimately just lead you down the wrong path and lead to confusion. My final tip for dealing with negative feedback is to talk it out. If you have any questions about the feedback that you received, or you're not totally clear what they were trying to convey, don't hesitate to ask that person for further clarification. If their goal is to help you strengthen this story, they should be more than happy to help. I always tell my clients that editing is a true collaborative effort, and engaging in a constructive conversation can provide you a much deeper understanding of their perspective, and then help you determine how you might productively apply the feedback to the work. For instance, it could be the case that you actually misunderstood their feedback, or they didn't convey it properly in whatever document you were communicating in. And maybe you do actually agree with it after all. Or after you have a conversation about the feedback with this person, perhaps they realize where you're coming from, and then their feedback changes based on what you tell them. These conversations can be so helpful and illuminating, and ultimately will help you find new ways to strengthen the story. So don't feel like once you receive feedback, you have to just shut up and never speak to that person ever again. I'm sure that they would be happy to discuss the feedback with you, because they took the time to provide that feedback and are thereby invested in helping you strengthen this story. I hope this video helped you understand how to deal with receiving negative feedback in a productive way, so that you can use constructive critique to take your story to the next level. Let me know in the comments if you've ever received bad feedback, and if so, how did you handle it? Did you ultimately change the story due to the feedback, or did you ignore it? If you're looking for tips on how to revise your manuscript based on feedback, I have another video with my top revision strategies. And before you head out, don't forget to hit that thumbs up button if you found this video helpful. It really helps out my channel. And hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And don't forget that free story self-assessment worksheet and my newsletter link in the description below. Thanks so much for watching and happy writing.